She had been grounded for 11 days. On the 12th, she took off anyway. That is where this story begins. Not with a battle, not with a briefing, not with someone giving an order or someone refusing one. It begins with a woman sitting alone in a hangar in the Nevada desert, holding a needle and a scrap of faded fabric, sewing something back together that the world had told her was already finished. Her name was Reeve Calloway, 34 years old, United States Air Force major. Assigned to the 57th Winger out of Creech Air Force Base 40 miles northwest of Las Vegas, where the desert flattened out into a pale bleached nothing, and the mountains to the west looked like they had been placed there by accident and never moved again. She flew the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, the ugliest aircraft in the American inventory, and by every account of the men who had called for it from the ground, the most beautiful thing they had ever seen in their lives. Reeve had flown it for 9 years. She had flown it into terrain that other pilots declined to enter twice. She had brought it back from places that should have killed her, landed it on runways with systems failing and fuel bleeding, and a fuselage that looked like it had been dragged through a quarry. She had never lost a man on the ground who was waiting for her. That was the record. 11 years of decisions and risks and judgment calls that added up to something the Air Force put in a folder and called exemplary. But the folder that mattered right now was the one on Brigadier General Stanton Pruitt's desk, and that folder had one word on the cover page: suspended. No elaboration, no formal hearing date, no specific incident cited with attached evidence. Just that word, and below it, a signature, and below the signature, a date that Reeve had stared at long enough to memorize 3 days before anything had happened that could have justified it. She took the folder when they handed it to her, read the single page inside, and set it on the corner of her bunk. Protest required energy she preferred to spend on things she could change. She went to find something to do with her hands. What she found was the patch. It lived in the inside left pocket of every flight suit she owned, transferred from one to the next without ceremony, tucked against her ribs like a second heartbeat. A rectangle of heavy cotton, once dark green, now the color of old paper, with 2 words embroidered in white thread that had gone gray from years of handling and being held in the dark. Hold fast. Her father had worn it on the same spot. Left side inside pocket over the heart. She had watched him transfer it herself once standing in the doorway of their kitchen in Colorado Springs when she was 12 years old, watching him move it from the suit he was retiring to the new one laid out on the table. He did not explain what the words meant or where the patch came from or whether it was regulation. She did not ask. She understood at 12 what she could not have articulated until much later. Some things do not need explaining. Some things you simply carry. His name was Warren Calloway. Air Force like her, a pilot like her. The specifics of what he flew and where he flew it were things she had never fully pieced together because the records that existed were incomplete in ways that felt deliberate, like pages torn from a book, rather than pages that had never been written. What she knew was that he was good at it. She knew that from the careful way other men chose their words when they spoke about him, in his absence, the slight pause before they answered when she asked questions as a teenager. What she also knew was that on a Tuesday morning in March of 2006, he drove to work and did not come home. No crash report, no notification of combat death, no flag folded at a graveside by officers in white gloves. Only silence and eventually a conversation with a man she had never met before and never saw again, who sat across from her mother in the living room and spoke in the careful tone of someone who had delivered this kind of news before and learned that the kindest version of it was still brutal. He said Warren had been involved in an operation he was not able to discuss. He said he was sorry. He said he knew that wasn't enough. It wasn't. Reeve was 16. Her brother Garrett was 20, already enlisted, already on the path toward the SEAL teams, already trained to sit very still and absorb information without reacting to it in the moment. He sat next to her on the couch while the man spoke, and when the man left, Garrett was quiet for a long time. Then he said, sometimes the military loses people in ways that don't have names. Reeve looked at the patch sitting on the table where her father had left it that morning. She picked it up. She put it in her pocket. 2 years later, she was in ROTC. 4 years after that, she was flying. She never talked about why. The people who needed to understand already did. Now she sat in Hangar 4 with a needle and a spool of gray thread reattaching a corner of the patch that had come loose from the lining of her current flight suit. The hangar smelled of hydraulic fluid and aluminum and the dry heat of Nevada in September that never quite became comfortable no matter how long you lived with it. Somewhere behind her, 2 mechanics worked with a torque wrench, the rhythmic sound of it settling into the quiet. The fluorescent light above buzzed at a frequency that should have been irritating, but had become, over 11 days, almost companionable. She worked slowly. She was not a woman who did things slowly as a rule, but this she did slowly because the patch deserved it and because slow work kept a certain kind of thinking at bay. The kind that circled, the kind that asked the same questions without arriving at answers. The suspension order had been signed by Brigadier General Stanton Pruill. She had served under Pruill's administrative authority for 4 years and had formed over that time a clear picture of the man. He was not stupid. He was not in the traditional sense of the word corrupt. He was something more difficult, a man who had decided certain things were necessary and stopped asking whether they were right. She had met men like that before. They were more dangerous than the ones who knew they were doing wrong. Colonel Dex Harmon had said 3 words to her in the hallway on the second day, spoken in passing without slowing his stride, in a voice pitched below the ambient noise of the corridor. This isn't over. She had carried those words the same way she carried the patch. Harmon was the kind of officer who communicated volumes through what he chose not to say, and what he had not said in 11 days was, turn in your equipment, clear your desk, accept this. She was nearly finished with the repair when the radio on the far wall changed. The change was subtle. No alarm, no emergency tone, just a shift in the background feed that most people had learned to hear without processing. Reeve had always been able to separate signal from noise in the air and on the ground both. And something in the new transmission snagged her attention before she consciously identified it. She looked up. The radio was mounted high on the concrete wall next to a fire suppression panel and a clock that read 11:47. The transmission was broken, cycling in and out of static in the pattern she associated with low-band signals, fighting their way through high-altitude terrain. Someone was transmitting from behind mountains. The words that came through were partial, fragmentary, the kind of thing a communications officer would log and flag and spend time cleaning up. She heard enough, 2 words repeating, a grid designation that she recognized the way you recognize a street corner from childhood, not because you can describe it in detail, but because your body knows it before your mind does. Sector 7C. The valley had a dozen informal names among pilots who had encountered it or its reputation. The most common one, repeated often enough to appear in informal operational briefings, was simply the Boneyard. It was a canyon system in the Sierra Nevada range northwest of the base in terrain that combined high ridge lines, unpredictable wind shear, natural GPS degradation from the surrounding rock formations, and geological heat signatures that confused certain targeting systems. It looked manageable on a map. It revealed itself as something else entirely when you were inside it. The Air Force had lost 2 drones and a reconnaissance aircraft in the Boneyard over the previous 4 years. The drones were replaceable. The reconnaissance aircraft's pilot had brought it back, but not cleanly, and after that the sector had been marked inactive, and the mark had held. Reeve had flown it once, 18 months ago, under circumstances that had since been redacted from the operational record in ways she had not been fully informed about. She had gone in to support a ground team being compressed from 3 sides. She had come out with a machine that needed 3 weeks of maintenance and a flight record that was, depending on who was reading it, either evidence of exceptional skill or evidence of unacceptable risk. Pruill had read it as the latter. That flight was the reason she was sitting in this hangar. She crossed to the radio and turned up the gain. The static increased, but so did the clarity in the gaps. She listened through 2 full cycles, parsing the fragments, and then she heard something underneath the operational language. A string of tones embedded in the signal the way a watermark is embedded in paper. Easy to miss. Designed to be missed by anyone not specifically told what to listen for. She had been told, once. Years ago, on a back porch in Virginia Beach in the summer, with a beer she had barely touched, in a conversation that lasted past midnight, Garrett had told her, if it ever comes through, you'll know it, because it sounds like nothing. Like a glitch. Like the radio coughing, 7 tones in a pattern that doesn't repeat in nature. If you ever hear that, wherever you hear it, that's me telling you I'm out of options. 7 tones. She had heard them twice in her life. Once in a test that night on the porch, Garrett tapping them out on a borrowed communications unit to show her what they sounded like. And once 4 minutes ago, embedded in a broken transmission from Sector 7C. She stood at the radio and did not move for approximately 4 seconds. She did not reach for a telephone or walk to the command building to present the information to the duty officer. She stood still and she listened to the transmission cycle through one more time, and she let the calculation happen in the part of her mind that had been doing that kind of calculation since she was old enough to understand that some decisions are already made before you make them. The suspension order was on her bunk in the barracks. Her access codes had been revoked on the day it was signed. Her name had been removed from the active flight roster, The mission notification lists the emergency support queue and every other channel through which she would normally have been informed that her brother's unit was operating in the boneyard. That last part was not incidental. Someone had known before the suspension was signed that there would be a situation in Sector 7C involving personnel she would move to support regardless of orders. And someone had moved to ensure she would not receive that information through any official channel. She had noticed the date discrepancy on the suspension order 4 days ago. She had sat with it, turned it over, examined it from every available angle. She had considered whether it was clerical. She had considered it long enough to arrive at the answer. She already knew it was not clerical. Nothing about Stanton Pearl was careless enough to be clerical. The order had been signed 72 hours before any documented violation existed. She walked back to the bench and finished the last 2 stitches on the patch without sitting down, standing with the fabric in one hand and the needle in the other. She tied off the thread and broke it with her teeth and smoothed the corner of the patch flat with her thumb. Hold fast. She put the flight suit on. Fury 2 was parked under an equipment overhang on the flight line 340 meters from the hangar door. She had walked that distance enough times to know the number without thinking about it. She walked it now without hurrying, because hurrying drew attention she did not need in the next 4 minutes, and because she had learned from 9 years of flying through situations that were trying to kill her, that pace and composure were not the same thing as calm. You could be running every calculation at full speed behind a face that gave nothing away. She was running them now. Fury 2 was not cleared for flight. It had been pulled from the active schedule along with her when the suspension was processed, sitting in the particular mechanical limbo of an aircraft between operational cycles. Not broken, not ready, waiting for authorization that nobody was currently positioned to give. The avionics had been partially shut down for an inspection that had not been completed. Fuel was at 78%. Hydraulics needed topping but were functional. Cannon armed. Flares partial. It would fly. Not cleanly, not with the full confidence of a machine properly signed off and briefed. But it would fly. She had brought it back from worse. The crew chief on the line was Staff Sergeant Weld, 26 years old, good at his job and smart enough to understand things without being told them. He saw her coming from 50 meters out. She watched him process it, the recognition, the calculation, the small internal debate visible in a half-second pause. He set down his clipboard. He stepped to the left. He said nothing. He did not have to. She climbed the boarding ladder and settled into the cockpit with the ease of returning to a posture her spine had memorized over thousands of hours. She ran the startup sequence from memory, bypassing the incomplete avionics inspection in 90 seconds. The engines lit with the low-frequency vibrations she felt more in her chest than heard with her ears throaty and unresolved in the first moments of ignition, like something large deciding whether to commit. The tower responded immediately. Fury 2, you are not scheduled for departure. Identify yourself in hold position. She keyed the radio once. Let them hear the engine sound. Fury 2, confirm authorization code and hold position. This is a direct order. She released the parking brake. She advanced the throttle. The aircraft rolled forward with the slightly heavy response of a machine that hadn't moved in 11 days, the landing gear complaining against the tarmac before finding its forward intention. Fury 2, you are not cleared. Hold position. The runway was empty. The desert beyond it was pale and flat, and the mountains to the west were a dark line against the morning sky. And somewhere beyond those mountains in a canyon, the Air Force had stopped calling by its proper name. Her brother was out of options. She advanced the throttle to take off power. Fury 2 accelerated with the quality she had never found a precise word for, something between commitment and violence. Speed building fast, and the nose lifting, and the gear separating from the ground. Then there was nothing beneath her but air and the enormous, indifferent Nevada sky. In the tower, a young flight operations officer ran to the window. The senior officer did not run. He stood at his station and watched the blip on his screen descend toward the deck, moving northwest, dropping below radar coverage in the way pilots drop below radar coverage when they know what they are doing and want to avoid detection. He had been at Creech for 11 years. He had seen Reeve Calloway fly in and out of this base for 4 of them. He had read the reports from the last canyon run. He said quietly to nobody in particular, "She's airborne." Then he picked up the telephone on his left and called Colonel Harmon's direct line. 30 miles northwest, the Sierra Nevada rose from the desert floor with the abrupt, almost affronted quality of the western ranges, as if they resented the flatness around them. The canyons that cut through them were not gentle. They had the character of millions of years of water and pressure and geological indifference, narrow and angular, and full of shadows that changed with the sun and wind patterns, that had no obligation to behave consistently. Reeve dropped to 200 feet as she crossed the first ridge line. She pushed lower, 180, 160. The proximity warnings began their sequence, and she clicked them off with the efficiency of someone who had made that decision in advance. She did not need the warnings, she needed the silence. Ahead, the canyon entrance narrowed to the passage she remembered, barely 300 feet wall to wall, with the wind shear from the east arriving in the variable pulses she had memorized from the last time. She adjusted trim manually, reading the aircraft's response through the yoke with the attention of someone reading a language learned by touch. Fury 2 resisted slightly, still warming, still finding its equilibrium. She gave it what it needed, and it gave her what she needed in return. The canyon accepted her the way it always had, not with welcome, with the neutral, terrible indifference of terrain that does not distinguish between what deserves to survive and what does not. She pushed forward into the shadow of it. Her eyes were already moving across the ridge lines, cataloging, sorting, filing. Movement here, stillness, there heat, signatures beginning to cluster on the upper slopes. They were watching. They had been watching since she crossed the entry point. She had expected that. She keyed her radio. Iron Bell to any echo units. Do you copy? Static. This is Iron Bell. If you're breathing, I am 10 miles north and inbound. A pause long enough that she began planning the first pass without a response. Then through the static, a voice. Exhausted. Controlled. Carrying in its flat, measured cadence the specific quality of someone who has been conserving everything, including hope, for a long time. Iron Bell, Sector 7C East Wall, 6 personnel, 2 critical, 3 sides covered. She recognized the voice the way she recognized very few things in the world, instantly and completely, and without any possibility of error. She had recognized it since she was 16 years old, on the morning she woke from dreams she wouldn't remember by noon, and called the number she had memorized and listened to it ring and heard him answer. She kept her response professional. The radio was not a private channel. Copy Bravo 9, hold position. Iron Bell is on approach. She checked fuel. She checked cannon. She checked the flare system, which gave her a reading that was already beginning to concern her. She looked at the ridge lines ahead, at the heat signatures multiplying on the upper slopes. She pushed the throttle forward. The first pass was information gathering. The canyon did not greet her with hostility at first. It greeted her with the kind of silence that pilots learn to distrust, the silence of hidden things. RPG crews waiting behind cover spotters, watching from shadows, the patience of people who have done this before and know that the aircraft will come back around. She mapped the positions in the first pass. 3 distinct groups, North Ridge, East Shelf, and a third element on the western approach that had not yet revealed itself, which was the most dangerous, because the things that had not shown themselves were always the ones that ended missions. The flare system was reading at 40% and declining. She noted this with concern rather than alarm, filed it, and turned for the second pass. The GAU-8 Avenger spooled up with a sound that had no adequate civilian equivalent. It was not an explosion and not a burst. It was a sustained mechanical tearing, as if the air itself was being ripped along a seam, and what came out of it hit the northern ridge formation at the cluster of heat signatures she had mapped, and the result was dust and rock and the sudden violent scatter of shapes that had been organized a moment before and were no longer organized at all. Contact north, she transmitted. Suppressed. Moving to East Shelf. The East Shelf took 2 passes. On the second one, she made a manual targeting correction with her right hand, while her left managed the throttle, and her feet worked the rudder pedals through a crosswind that arrived without warning from the south and tried to push her into the rock face with the casual indifference of physics. She corrected for it. The cannon fired. The shelf went quiet. She was 3 passes in when the flare system failed completely. Not degraded. A flat 0 on the readout, the indicator going from amber to red to simply off. She looked at it for 1 second. Then she looked at the ridge lines and the sky above the canyon, blue and clear and entirely indifferent to her situation, and she made a decision not to spend any more time on what she couldn't change. Bravo 9, she transmitted. Report status. The voice that came back was the same voice but different now. Something in it released that had been held before, the way a muscle releases after sustained tension. Still professional, still precise, but underneath the precision, something that belonged to a different context than a combat radio exchange. Reeve, I knew you'd come. She did not respond immediately. What she wanted to say had no place in the register they were using. The military register that stripped everything down to information and left everything else to exist in the spaces between transmissions. She wanted to say, I have been carrying your emergency code in my memory for 6 years waiting to hear it. She wanted to say, you are my brother, and that is the whole explanation. What she said was 2 more passes and your west approach is clear. Start moving in 4 minutes. A pause. Then copy. That was the whole of it. It had always been enough between them. This particular economy of language developed over a childhood that required them to communicate in compressed form, two people learning to say necessary things without the luxury of time or safety or the assumption that there would always be another opportunity. She heard what was underneath his words, and he heard what was underneath hers, and they understood each other completely and moved on because there was still work to do. She banked into the approach for the fourth pass. The stabilizer feedback was inconsistent now, the left side lagging slightly behind the right, the aircraft compensating in ways she could feel in the yoke as a heaviness that had not been there at takeoff. Fury 2 had been sitting for 11 days. The inspection had not been completed. She was flying a machine that was not fully ready in terrain, that was not forgiving without countermeasures with degrading control response. She had flown worse. The fourth pass cleared the western approach. She saw the movement she had anticipated, shapes repositioning south in response to the pressure from north and east, and she marked the new positions and made the calculation for the fifth pass. It was during the fifth pass in the half-second window between weapon release and the necessary pull-up that she saw it. She almost missed it. Embedded in the rock face of the western wall, tucked into a crevice approximately 40 meters above the canyon floor, small enough and well camouflaged enough to be invisible to any observation, not moving at her speed and altitude, and therefore catching the glint of the metal housing at exactly the angle she happened to be at in exactly that fraction of a second. She pulled up, she marked the location. She turned it over during the next approach, and what she arrived at changed the nature of what she was inside. The device was a jamming unit. She recognized the housing from her systems, and avionics training recognized the dimensions and the antenna array orientation. It was designed to suppress GPS acquisition and degrade low-band radio communications across a specific geographic area. Designed to create exactly the conditions that existed in Sector 7C, the radio degradation, the coordinate confusion, the inability to get a clean signal in or out. The device had a model designation she had seen in domestic inventory documentation. In the procurement records reviewed during a systems familiarization course 2 years ago at Nellis, when a training officer had walked through current Air Force electronic warfare assets, AN/ALQ-231, manufactured in the United States. On the inventory list of exactly 2 installations in the country that operated at 10 platforms, Creech Air Force Base was one of them. She held this information at arm's length for the duration of the next approach. She held it where she could see it available when she needed it, and she did not let it pull her focus from the ridge lines and the heat signatures in the ground team now beginning to move in the shadows below. She fired. She pulled up. She came around again. The sixth pass took the last of the organized resistance from the North Ridge. She could hear it in the way the ground team's movement changed the shift from the careful compression of people moving under direct fire to the faster committed movement of people who have been given a lane and are using it. Garrett's voice came through once brief, confirming movement. She acknowledged, 2 kilometers to the extraction point, open ground between them, and it, which was both better and worse than canyon walls better, because she could see it clearly from above, worse, because they could be seen clearly from above by anything still watching. She was thinking about what was still watching when the final functioning warning system in her avionics suite produced a tone she had not heard during the mission so far. Not a proximity warning, not a weapons lock alert, something quieter and more specific belonging to a system she had not been monitoring because she had not expected it to report anything. The emission detector. She looked at the readout, a signal originating from inside the aircraft, not from the terrain around her. From inside Fury 2, from the forward fuselage at the location where structural support members intersected with the undercarriage mounting. A frequency she did not recognize from any standard equipment catalog. Steady, consistent, broadcasting. She understood what it meant before she fully formed the thought. A beacon, hidden inside the airframe. Installed during the 11 days the aircraft sat unattended under the overhang, accessible to anyone with maintenance credentials, and enough time and the specific knowledge of where, in an A-10's frame, you could mount something small enough to be missed on a standard inspection and stable enough to broadcast through the vibration of operational flight. She had not flown into the boneyard by chance and been found by hostile elements who happened to have equipment staged in the terrain. She had been sent here. Someone had looked at the situation in Sector 7C, at the grounded pilot who would respond to a signal from her brother regardless of orders, and had made a set of decisions designed to end with Fury 2 destroyed in a canyon the Air Force had already stopped caring about, and its pilot listed as a casualty of unsanctioned action in a restricted sector. Clean, documented, nobody to contradict the account. The suspension order, signed 3 days before any violation existed, suddenly made a different kind of sense. It was not punitive, it was preparatory. She transmitted once on the encrypted channel, keeping her voice level and her language precise. Iron bell to forward operations. Be advised, Fury 2 is broadcasting a non-standard emission from forward fuselage origin. Internal frequency, unknown to standard inventory. Treat as hostile installation. Recommend forensic review on landing. She did not wait for acknowledgement. She turned the aircraft southeast and filed the information away. The Chinooks were inbound. She heard the transmission confirming launch from the forward base, 2 aircraft approximately 8 minutes out. She watched the extraction point from above while the ground team covered the last kilometer, and the valley had gone into one of those silences she had learned not to trust. Too quiet, the wrong quality. She climbed slightly for a cleaner angle on the southern approach to the landing zone and swept her thermal optics across the terrain in the methodical way she had refined under pressure. North wall clear, east approach clear, west clear, south. 3 signatures, faint, deliberate, tucked into shadow beneath a boulder formation on the southern ridge approximately 200 meters from the landing zone perimeter. They were not angled toward the SEAL team. They were angled toward the open ground of the landing zone itself at the altitude and orientation of people who were not waiting for infantry. They were waiting for aircraft. She looked at their positioning. She looked at where the Chinooks would come in. She thought about the fuel tank placement on a CH-47, which she knew from memory because she had flown support for enough of them to know what they were carrying and where they were carrying it and what happened when something hot and fast found those locations. They were not trying to kill the SEAL team. The SEAL team was bait. She had been bait. The target was the aircraft, the valuable, irreplaceable aircraft that would come in low and slow to pick up the ground team, presenting the cleanest possible shot to someone positioned and ready with the right equipment and no particular concern about what they were destroying. She dove. No transmission, no warning call, no time. She dove with the throttle at maximum and the nose pointed at the southern ridge and the cannon cycling up and the math already solved. The ground came up fast. She fired. The GAU-8 spoke its tearing language into the boulder formation, and 2 of the 3 signatures went from active to nothing. The third scrambled laterally behind the rock, and she was past the ridgeline and pulling up into the hard G of a recovery climb before she could acquire for a second burst. She heard it as she pulled up. Not the launch tone, because her warning systems were not functioning at full capacity. The thing underneath the launch tone, the pressure change, the particular way air moves differently when something fast and heat-seeking has entered it and is looking for a target. She leveled and looked back. The missile was tracking her engines. Her engines were the hottest things in the canyon, and the flares were gone, and there was nothing between her and what was coming except rock wall and the decision she was going to make in the next 4 seconds. She did not try to outrun it. Outrunning a heat-seeking missile in level flight is not a strategy. It is a delay and a short one. She looked at the canyon walls. She looked at the geometry of the space ahead. She looked at the northern end of the canyon where the wall curved slightly inward before opening into the wider passage leading back to the desert. She turned toward it. This was not instinct. It was calculation presented in the compressed wordless form that decisions take when you have 4 seconds and a lot of experience. She was going to fly directly at a rock face, and at the last possible moment before impact, she was going to pull into a vertical climb, and the missile behind her was going to have less than a second to make the same correction, and rock faces do not move. She pushed the throttle to its mechanical stop. Fury 2 accelerated with everything it had. The rock face filled her windscreen. The proximity warnings she had disabled were silent, but her body knew what was close through the change in light, through the vibration that came from the air between the aircraft and the stone. She pulled. The G-load pressed her into the seat with the authority of physics demanding its due, and the aircraft went vertical, and the rock face passed underneath with a clearance she would not have been comfortable estimating afterward. The missile did not make the pull. She heard the detonation below her as Fury 2 climbed into the open sky above the canyon, felt it in the airframe as a single hard shudder. The pressure wave from an explosion 50 meters behind and below, rolling through the fuselage and back out. The left engine coughed. She adjusted throttle. She reduced the climb angle. She nursed the left engine through a rough transition, and it steadied, objecting, but functional. She leveled out above the canyon at 1,500 feet and did a rapid systems check and found the aircraft worse than 5 minutes ago, but still flying, still armed, still hers. Below her, the landing zone was clear. She came back down. The first Chinook was on approach blades, clattering with the heavy, purposeful sound of a large machine that knows what it is doing. The second was holding a quarter-mile out, rotating slowly. She could see the ground team below, the organized compression of the final approach to the landing zone. People carrying people, the brutal choreography of an extraction from a position that should not have been survivable. She flew a slow perimeter over the zone. She scanned every ridgeline. The southern boulder formation was still. The north wall was still. The east shelf was still. She let herself believe for approximately 30 seconds that it was over. Then she looked up at the northern ridge. He was standing on the highest point on a spine of rock that jutted above the main ridgeline like a point on a crown. Not armed, or if armed, the weapon was not visible and not raised, not moving. Standing with his weight slightly forward, hands at his sides, face toward her aircraft in the posture of someone watching with complete attention and no intention of acting on what they saw. She had seen that posture once before, not recently, not in any operational context. In a photograph taken in the backyard of a house in Colorado Springs in the summer, he was 11 years old. A man standing at the back fence looking at something in the middle distance that the camera had not captured, his weight forward, his hands at his sides entirely still, in the way that people are still when they are concentrating on something they cannot look away from. She had kept that photograph in the same drawer as the patch for 20 years. Her hands did not move on the controls. Her breath did not change. She was at 200 feet and moving at 120 knots, and the figure on the ridgeline was already passing out of her direct line of sight as she continued the perimeter sweep. And by the time she completed the turn and came back to the northern heading, he was gone. The ridgeline was empty. Rock shadowed the indifferent geometry of terrain. She told herself there were many people with that posture. She told herself distance and altitude distorted recognition. She told herself she had been flying for over an hour with degraded systems in the aftermath of a missile detonation 50 meters behind her aircraft, and that the mind under those conditions will sometimes find familiar shapes in unfamiliar places. She kept flying the perimeter. She kept the zone clear. The first Chinook touched down. The loading went fast, the way these things went fast, when the people doing them had been waiting to do them for a long time. She watched from above, counting shapes moving up the ramp, watching ridge lines running the fuel calculation. The second Chinook came in, loaded, lifted. The canyon below her was empty. Smoke from the cannon strikes still rose from two positions on the ridge lines. The jamming device was still in the rock face. The beacon was still broadcasting from inside her fuselage. All of it present, waiting to be assembled into something that someone with authority would have to look at. She began her return vector. Fury 2 groaned in the way machines groan when they have been used past their comfortable limits. Left engine running 10 degrees hotter than normal. Stabilizer response still lagging. Hydraulics adequate, a term she was applying generously. The airframe had absorbed a pressure wave that maintenance would need to examine carefully. She did not think about this as a problem. She thought about it as information. Fury 2 was telling her it was tired. She understood. They had 40 miles to go. The desert opened below her as she climbed above the ridgeline and turned southeast, and the base appeared in the distance as it always appeared when she was coming back from somewhere difficult, small and flat and entirely ordinary. A collection of buildings and runways that looked like nothing from the air, and was to her the specific kind of familiar that you only develop for a place you have returned to many times from situations where return was not guaranteed. She descended toward the runway at Creech. Fury 2 came down with her. The dark SUV was already waiting at the edge of the tarmac. She noted it and noted what it meant, and felt for the first time since she had climbed into the cockpit that morning, something in her shoulders begin to release. She had done what she came to do. She lined up on the runway. She brought Fury 2 home. The front landing strut gave on touchdown. Not catastrophically. Not in the way that ends a landing in fire and metal, and the kind of reports that take months to write. It gave in the way that overtaxed components give when they have been asked to perform past their design tolerance for long enough that the tolerance becomes a memory. A slow compression that went 2 inches further than it should have and stopped there, leaving Fury 2 sitting on the tarmac at a forward angle, immediately visible to anyone watching from the tower and communicating without any accompanying documentation the full nature of what the aircraft had just been through. Reeve felt it in the seat. She corrected for it, automatically managing the rollout with the adjustments the asymmetric contact required, bringing the aircraft to a stop at the far end of the usable runway. She shut the engines down manually. She flipped the master switch. She sat in the sudden silence for exactly 3 seconds, the amount of time her body required to transition from the neurological state of active flight to the neurological state of everything else. A boundary she had learned to respect. 3 seconds, then she climbed out. The ladder was not in place. She went over the side the way she had gone over the side of aircraft when ladders were unavailable, using the handholds on the fuselage with the economy of someone who had done this in worse conditions than a calm Nevada morning with no one shooting at her. Her boots hit the tarmac with a sound quieter than she expected, a soft, flat contact with solid ground after an hour of everything being either very loud or very dangerous. The ground crew was coming from 2 directions. She walked past them without stopping. There was nothing to say that the aircraft had not already communicated, and they were already looking at it with the attention it deserved. The SUV was 80 meters away. 2 of them plain uniforms, no rank insignia, no unit designation, not MPs. These 2 had the posture of people whose job was to convey rather than compel. She stopped in front of them. "Major Calloway, we need you to come with us. Am I being charged?" "No, ma'am." "Is this a court-martial proceeding?" "No, ma'am. Command review." She nodded once. She got in the vehicle. The route took them past the main administrative complex, past the briefing buildings, past the standard debriefing rooms she had expected to be taken to. It continued through a security gate requiring the driver to present credentials and wait for a second verification before the barrier lifted, and then through a second gate, and then to a building she had seen from a distance on several occasions, but had never had reason to approach. Low, windowless, architecturally unremarkable in the way that buildings are sometimes unremarkable by deliberate design. Inside, the corridors were narrow. The lighting was the neutral fluorescent light of spaces designed for function without consideration of how long people would spend in them. She was taken down one corridor and then another and deposited in a room at the end of the second corridor that had 1 long table, 2 chairs, a framed photograph of water on the wall, and nothing else. She sat in the chair that faced the door. The other chair was already occupied. Fletcher Steen was 60 years old and looked it in the way that people look their age when their age represents something substantial, when the years have been used rather than merely passed. His face had the quality of terrain weathered by something specific, and his eyes had the stillness of someone who had learned to present less than he was observing. Not in uniform. Civilian clothes well made without distinction. The sartorial equivalent of the building they were sitting in. He did not rise when she entered. He waited until she was seated. Then he opened the folder in front of him. "You took off without clearance." He did not look up. "You operated in a restricted sector without authorization. You engaged without CAS approval. You used munitions off the active roster. You flew an aircraft not cleared for flight on an airframe under maintenance review." He turned a page. "You eliminated 11 confirmed hostile positions. You disrupted what our signals intelligence is now identifying as a staged ambush designed to destroy 2 extraction aircraft and their crews. You recovered 6 personnel, including 2 critical casualties, assessed as unlikely to have survived another 40 minutes of ground exposure. And you did all of this in an aircraft that should not have been able to fly the profile you flew it on." He closed the folder. He looked up. "You don't seem concerned." She met his eyes. "I've had worse days." He looked at her in the way people look at things they are in the process of reassessing. Then he reached into the folder and placed a photograph on the table between them. Aerial infrared, the grainy, greenish quality of imagery taken from a high-altitude platform. It showed the canyon in the later stages of the mission, smoke still rising from 2 positions on the ridge lines. It showed Fury 2 caught in a banking turn at low altitude, and it showed on the northern ridge at the highest point a figure, standing, still, watching. Staten let her look at it. She said, "Who is that?" "That is the question we have been trying to answer for several years. He has appeared in thermal imagery from this sector on 3 separate occasions over the past 4 years. Same position or an equivalent position on the ridge. Same posture. Present during 2 previous operations in this sector that did not involve you. And present. Today. Is he one of yours?" "No." "Is he hostile?" Staten paused. "We don't believe so. His positioning on every occasion has been observational rather than tactical. He has never interfered with operations. He has never communicated with ground forces on either side that we have been able to detect. He watches. Then he is gone." She said nothing. She was aware of the photograph and of the things she was not asking yet, and of the calculation she was running about whether to ask it now or wait. People like Fletcher Steen had information they intended to share, and information they intended to withhold, and the line between those categories was not always fixed from the beginning of a conversation. Staten said, "Before we discuss the figure, I need to tell you about the valley." She waited. He said Sector 7C has been used as an evaluation corridor since 1981. Not officially, not in any document that exists in the standard operational record. It was established by a working group operating within the Air Force's Advanced Pilot Assessment Framework with the specific purpose of identifying pilots who performed at exceptional levels under conditions that could not be replicated in any controlled training environment. The theory was straightforward. You cannot fully assess a pilot's capability in a simulator or a training range because the pilot knows they are being assessed. You can only see what someone truly is when the stakes are real and the outcome is not guaranteed. She said they put pilots in that canyon on live missions. They used the canyon's natural characteristics to create conditions that existing missions sometimes required passage through. They did not manufacture the threats. They identified operations that were going to happen anyway and routed them through terrain that would provide the information they needed about the people flying them. She said, and 3 pilots died. Staten was quiet for 2 seconds. Yes. She said, and Pruell ran this program. Pruell was the most recent custodian. He did not create it. He inherited it from the officer who preceded him, who inherited it from the officer who preceded him. The program is older than Pruell's involvement by approximately 2 decades. He believed in its necessity. He believed the information it generated was worth the cost. I am not defending that position. I am describing it accurately. She looked at the photograph of the canyon. She thought about the jamming device in the western wall. She thought about the beacon in Fury 2's fuselage. She said the suspension order. The beacon, the jamming equipment from our inventory. That was Pruell. We believe so. The evidence Colonel Harmon has assembled over the past 3 hours is substantial. The beacon's installation traces to a maintenance window during which access to Fury 2 was logged under credentials authorized through Pruell's administrative chain. The AN/ALQ-231 units were drawn from inventory on a request Pruell approved 6 weeks ago under a training exercise designation that does not correspond to any exercise that actually took place. She said he didn't want me in the canyon because I was being evaluated. No, he wanted you in the canyon because he had decided you were not a controllable asset. Your last mission in that sector produced results that went outside the parameters he considered acceptable. You survived conditions designed to be terminal. You came back with information he didn't want transmitted. The suspension was meant to be the end of it. When the situation with Bravo 9 developed, he saw a way to resolve the problem more permanently. She sat with this for a moment. It had the quality of information that was not surprising and was still difficult to fully absorb, because there is a difference between having suspected something and having it confirmed in a windowless room by a man who speaks about it with the calm of someone reading from a technical document. She said, "Where is he now?" Colonel Harmon has placed him under administrative detention pending formal review. The evidence package is with the Inspector General's office. The process will be what the process is. It will take the time it takes. He paused. I want you to understand that the process will happen. Whatever else occurs, Pruell's conduct in this matter will be examined and adjudicated. I am telling you that as a fact, not as a reassurance. She heard the distinction. She appreciated it. She said the program. The evaluation quarter. Does it continue? That is above my authority to answer. It is a question the review will likely address. He looked at her with the direct assessing quality he had maintained throughout. I will tell you that the program has generated identification of every exceptional pilot currently operating in this theater. Every one of them was passed through that corridor, or a corridor like it. Every one of them survived it without knowing they were being evaluated and flew better for not knowing. That is the argument that will be made in the program's defense. I am not making it. I am telling you it will be made. She said, in the 3 who died. He said will be the argument against. The room was quiet. The fluorescent light continued overhead. She looked at the photograph of water on the wall and thought that whoever had chosen it for this room had understood something about the conversations that happened here, the need for something to look at that made no demands. Staten stood. He picked up the folder. He moved toward the door with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had other places to be and had given this room the time it required. He stopped. She watched him the way she watched everything in a room she was uncertain about the full attention she normally distributed across multiple points of observation, concentrated on a single point, because a single point had declared itself worth watching. He reached into his bag and removed a folder that was different from the one he had been working from. Older. The cover was a brown that had once been something else worn down to its current state by years of handling. The edges were darkened in a way that spoke of proximity to something that burned without quite burning it. No label, no date, no designation of any kind on the outside. He set it on the table. He did not explain it. He did not look at her when he set it down. He walked to the door, opened it, and left without another word, and the sound of the door closing behind him was the quietest sound she had heard all day. She did not move toward the folder immediately. She sat with it on the table in front of her, and she looked at it the way she had been giving her attention to the room, and she was aware in the specific way she was sometimes aware of things before she understood them, that what was in the folder was going to be the kind of information that divides time into before and after. She had encountered this quality in information before rarely, and she had learned that the moment before you opened the thing was the last moment in which you had the option of not knowing. She surrendered it. She opened the folder. The first page was a cover sheet, most of its lines buried under redaction bars so thorough that what remained told her almost nothing except the shape of what had been removed. She could see it was an evaluation document. She could see it used a numerical scoring framework she did not recognize. The office designation had been blacked out with the same deliberate thoroughness as everything else. She turned to the second page. It was an aerial photograph, black and white, the high contrast grain of infrared imaging from a platform above the canyon. She recognized the terrain immediately. The geometry of the walls, the angle of the northern ridge, the particular shape of the drainage at the canyon floor. Sector 7C from directly above, caught in the specific light signature of early morning, and in the canyon an A-10. Wing's distinctive fuselage unmistakable, caught in a low-altitude diving approach at an angle she recognized because she had flown the same approach herself this morning. The photograph was dated September 1987. She was 4 years from being born in September 1987. She turned to the third page. It was not a photograph. It was a personnel documentation sheet, the kind that accompanied evaluation files listing identifying information for the subject under review. Most of the fields were redacted, name redacted, unit designation redacted, service record number redacted. But the form had a section she had not seen in standard personnel files, a section labeled personal effects and identifying items, apparently added as an addendum to this particular evaluation framework, a way of establishing continuity of identity across records that had been otherwise stripped clean. One item was listed, cloth patch, cotton hand-stitched, worn inside left chest lining of flight suit, approximately 3 by 2 inches. Background dark green faded. Thread color white faded to gray. Text 2 words hand-embroidered. Hold fast. She read the line 3 times. The description was precise in the way that official documentation is precise, the way someone trained to observe and record had looked at a specific object and written down exactly what it was with the neutrality of a person doing their job. It described the patch she had been carrying for 18 years. It described the patch she was carrying right now against her left ribs in the lining of the flight suit she had worn into the boneyard this morning. It described it with the accuracy of someone who had held it, or seen it held, or watched it be transferred from one suit to another on a kitchen table in Colorado Springs. She turned to the fourth page. It was a single handwritten note, 4 lines. The ink had faded from blue toward gray over decades, but the handwriting was still clear. The small, precise script of someone who had written a great deal by hand and developed an economy of motion in it. No flourishes, no unnecessary pen lifts, just words placed on the page with the directness of someone who knew what they meant to say. Sector 7C evaluation complete. Subject identified as asset of highest operational value. Recommendation removed from standard operational record. Do not expose to conventional command structure. Assigned per Protocol 7. Below the 4 lines a signature, partially obscured by a redaction bar applied over the printed name beneath it. The name was gone, but the signature itself was above the bar in the same hand as the note, and the bar had not touched it. She recognized the handwriting before she recognized the signature. She recognized it from the inside cover of a book that had lived on the second shelf of a bookcase in a house in Colorado Springs, and from the back of a photograph taken at a county fair when she was 9, and from a birthday card received in the mail, the autumn she turned 15, 3 months before the man who wrote it drove to work one Tuesday morning in March 2006 and did not come home. Her father's handwriting. Warren Calloway had written this note. He had been in Sector 7C in September 1987, 7 years before she was born. He had been evaluated. He had been identified. And then he had been moved to a place that did not appear in any record she had access to, not in 1987, and not in the 18 years that followed, not until March 2006, when his absence had been explained with words that were technically accurate and entirely insufficient. He had not disappeared because of an operation a man in her living room could not discuss. He had been seen. He had been claimed. He had stepped through a door that the program held open for people who proved themselves in that canyon, and the door had closed behind him, and what was on the other side of it was the question she was going to spend whatever time was necessary answering. She sat with this for a long time, not a measured clinical amount of time, a real amount, the kind that cannot be accurately quantified because the unit of measurement that applies is not minutes. She sat with the folder open and she breathed slowly the way she breathed in the aircraft when the situation was at its worst and the options were narrowing and the body needed to be reminded that it was still capable of the next action. In and out, the air in the room tasted of filtered, nothing the specific absence of weather that climate-controlled spaces have, and she sat in it and she let what she had just read become real. She had not cried for her father in 20 years. Not because the grief was not present. It had always been present, the low continuous pressure of an absence that did not resolve the way certain injuries ache in cold weather long after they have technically healed. She had not cried because crying required a specific kind of certainty about what had been lost, and she had never had that certainty, had never been given the clean information that would have allowed her to mourn in the form the world had designed for mourning. She did not cry now either. But something released. Something that had been held at the particular tension of unresolved uncertainty for 2 decades released in the way that things release when the uncertainty is finally resolved, not with violence, not with relief exactly, but with the quiet adjustment of a structure, finding a new equilibrium. She had not known whether her father was alive or dead. She still did not know. But she knew now that his disappearance had been a choice or something close enough to a choice that the distinction was academic. He had been seen. He had been claimed. He had stepped through a door and it had closed behind him, and what was on the other side of it was the question she was going to find the answer to regardless of how long it took or what it cost. She closed the folder. She placed her hand flat on its cover and held it there for a moment. Then she stood up. She picked up the folder, considered it for a moment, and set it back down. It did not belong with her yet. It belonged to the accounting that was coming for the program, and for Pruill, and for the 3 pilots whose names were not in any document she could access. It could be evidence. It should be evidence. She was going to make sure someone whose job was to assemble evidence knew it was in this room. She walked to the door and opened it. The corridor outside was empty. She walked back through the building, and when she reached the outer door, she pushed it open. And the Nevada afternoon came in all at once, the flat, dry heat and the enormous sky and the smell of jet fuel from the flight line. Colonel Harmon was standing outside, not the SUV, not the plain uniformed escorts. Harmon in his working uniform standing in the shade of the overhang with his hands clasped in front of him, the expression of a man who has been waiting and is prepared for multiple versions of what he might see when the door opens. He looked at her face. He looked at her flight suit. He did not ask what had happened in the room. He was too good an officer for that, and he already understood more than most people in this facility understood because he had spent 3 hours assembling evidence that told its own version of the story. He said, Pruill is in custody. The IG has the package. The beacon has been confirmed. The inventory draw on the jamming equipment has been confirmed. The timeline on the suspension order has been confirmed. She said there's a folder in the room I just came from. It needs to be part of the record. He nodded once. He did not ask what was in it. She said, Garrett. Harmon said at Landstuhl, both critical casualties are in surgery. Garrett is stable. He's asking about you. She absorbed this. Stable was not fine and not whole, but it was alive, and alive was the category that mattered. She would deal with the gradations within alive when she was able to get to him, which would depend on the next several days and what they contained. She said, what happens now? Harmon said to Pruill, the process. To the program, a review that will take longer than either of us would like and produce a result that will be a compromise and will not fully satisfy anyone. He paused. To you, that depends on what State had to say. She thought about the folder and the personnel documentation sheet and the 4 handwritten lines. She thought about the signature above the redaction bar. She said, he didn't tell me much. Harmon looked at her with the look of someone who had heard that sentence applied to Fletcher Steen before. He said he never does. But he tells you enough. She thought that was probably accurate. The flight line was 300 meters to her left. She could see Fury 2 from where she was standing, sitting at its forward angle on the buckled strut, surrounded by maintenance personnel already doing the work of assessing what the morning had cost. The aircraft looked worse from this distance than it had from inside it, which was generally the case with things that had been through significant damage. She said to Harmon, when can she fly again? He said, the way they're talking, 3 weeks minimum. Maybe less if you push it. She said, I'll push it. He nodded and said nothing else. He was the kind of officer who knew when a conversation had reached its conclusion. She began walking toward the flight line, not because there was anything she could do for the aircraft right now that the maintenance crew was not already doing, because it was the direction that felt right toward the machine rather than away from it, toward the work rather than away from it. She was halfway to the line when she stopped. She turned and looked northwest. The Sierra Nevada range was a dark line on the horizon, the peaks holding the last of the afternoon light. The canyons invisible from here. The boneyard invisible. The ridgelines invisible. It looked like a painting from this distance, the kind of landscape that existed to be looked at rather than flown through. She knew what it contained. She knew it contained a canyon used as a test for 40 years that had killed people and produced the most capable pilots currently operating in this theater. She knew it contained jamming equipment from their own inventory and a program that had operated in the space between authorization and acknowledgement for decades and would now be subject to a review that might not resolve what it needed to resolve. She knew it contained somewhere on a ridgeline at its northern end a figure who stood with his weight slightly forward and his hands at his sides. She did not know if her father was alive. She did not know what Protocol 7 meant, or where it had taken him, or what the 18 years between the photograph and the Tuesday morning he did not come home had contained. She did not know if the figure on the ridgeline was him, or a shape that the mind had assembled from need and distance and the particular tricks of aerial observation. She knew she was going back into that canyon, not today, not in 3 weeks when Fury 2 was flyable again. She was going back when she had enough information to go back with purpose rather than with desperation, and she was going to find what was on that ridgeline, and she was going to have the answer to the question that had organized her life since she was 16 years old. Without her fully understanding, that was what it was doing. The patch was against her ribs. The 2 words were there, worn into the fabric by years of carrying them. Hold fast. She had held. She had held through the canyon and the missile and the beacon and the suspension and the folder and Fletcher Steen's careful selective account of things she was only beginning to understand. She had held the way the aircraft held past comfortable limits, past the tolerances the design had specified, into the territory where holding is a decision made against the available evidence and sustained by something that does not have a technical name. She turned back toward the flight line. She walked toward it in the long Nevada light, the shadow stretching ahead of her, the smell of jet fuel and dry air, and the metallic scent of aircraft that had been working hard. Above her, the sky was the color it got in the late afternoon out here, a blue so deep it was almost a statement, the kind of sky that made distances visible rather than obscuring them. She reached Fury 2. She stopped in front of it and looked at it the way she always looked at it after a mission that had tested both of them, with the attention that was part assessment and part something harder to name, the specific regard you develop for a machine that has kept you alive in places where alive was not the guaranteed outcome. The buckled strut, the cannon ports with the residue of the morning's work still on the housing, the panel on the left wing that had opened again under load, the scratches and repairs that accumulated over time into a kind of biography, a record of where it had been and what it had been asked to do and what it had been willing to do when asked. The crew chief was nearby doing his own version of the same assessment. She said, "What's the fastest you can have her ready?" He looked at the aircraft. He did the calculation with his eyes honest about what was possible and what wasn't. He said 2.5 weeks if nothing else breaks. She said, "Make it 2. He nodded. He did not ask why. He had watched her walk across the tarmac that morning and take off without clearance and fly into terrain that wasn't authorized and bring the aircraft back with a buckled strut and a story that was already moving through the base, the way stories move through bases, person to person, each telling, carrying the weight of something that people recognized as significant without being able to fully articulate why. He understood without being told. That was the quality she valued most in the people around her. She looked at the aircraft one more time. She looked northwest at the mountains, at the last light on the ridge lines, at the place in the distance where the canyon sat invisible and silent and full of things she did not yet fully understand. She turned away. Not because she was finished with that direction, because she had work to do first, and she had never in her life moved towards something before she was ready. She walked off the flight line. The Nevada sky deepened overhead. The stars came out one at a time, and then all at once, the way things that have been present all along become visible when the conditions finally allow it. Somewhere in the Sierra Nevada, the canyon was quiet. And on a ridgeline at its northern end, if you had been there, if you had looked up at exactly the right moment in the last of the light, you might have seen a figure standing against the sky with his weight slightly forward and his hands at his sides, entirely still in the way that people are still when they are watching something they have been waiting a long time to see. And then he turned and walked back into the darkness of the high terrain with the ease of someone who knew the ground, who had known it for a very long time, who was not lost, who was waiting for the question that was already on its way to him, carried by a woman in a patch flight suit 30 miles to the southeast, who had learned to hold fast from the same man who had taught her, without words, that some doors only open from the inside, and that the only way to find out what was on the other side was to prove first that you were the kind of person who deserved to know. She was that person. She had proved it today. And in 2 weeks, when the aircraft was ready and the evidence was assembled and her brother was well enough to hear what she had found in a folder with burned edges and a signature above a redaction bar, she was going to walk back out to the flight line and climb back into the cockpit and fly northwest into the mountains and find out what her father had become in the years since the program had claimed him, and whether the 2 words he had left behind for her were a farewell or a promise. She was going to find out. She always did.